Well, we can get started.
Yeah.
Janine, if you want to kick it off.
Yeah, so thank you for everyone that is here and participating. Special guest is Joan Reed, who is it Director of Compliance? Sheriff Reed?
Compliance broker. Yeah, sheriff.
Compliance
Sheriff.
broker. Okay. I don't know, but she's wonderful and magical, and she's got a really good brain. And then we have Sarah Jo Diedrich, who represents the hotline that you guys can call in and ask questions. And she partners with Stephanie Minnick, who is maybe or maybe not on her way to family reunion in California. We don't know. So I invited these gals here to talk about what are the top phone calls, what are the top questions that people are calling in on? And with Joan, what are you seeing coming across your desk that we should be aware of, that maybe it's a trend that she's seeing that we need to improve on as agents? So with that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Sarah Jo first, and tell us about yourself and maybe share the number as well, in case people don't know how to get a hold of the hotline.
I wasn't prepared with the number, and I should have it by heart. Let me look that up. I bet Sydney has it. I
probably
do
don't have it. Oh, you
I
do
have it. Okay, so the helpline number is 414-368-9359. So that's 414-368-9359. And you can text that number as well. I guess I'll just throw this in there. So as Janine mentioned, I do this with Stephanie Minnick, and we sometimes have deals with some of you, and I know you know our cell phone numbers, but if you could call the hotline number and not our personal cells, because our mind switches when it's a helpline call. If I'm picking up my phone, I think it's for, you want to invite me out for coffee or drinks. No, I don't know. But if you call me on the helpline, I know that you're like, okay, this is a helpline call, and then it'll help us navigate which one of us has a moment to pick it up. So that's the first thing. Janine, do you want me to roll into my top 5 right away?
Sure. Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
If you're on a team, can you still reach out to the hotline?
Absolutely. And anybody can reach out to the hotline. Sometimes it's just nice to bounce ideas off one another.
Perfect.
I mean, Stephanie Minnick and we do the helpline, and the other day she called me, she's like, I just need to make sure my head is thinking of this right. So it helps just to sound things out. It doesn't matter if you've been in the business 1 month, 1 year, 10 years, there's still things that you come across that you're like, wait a minute. Now, what did Joan say in the meeting about that form that we have to fill out? It takes a minute. So.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Roll into it, lady.
All right. So here's I sat down with Stephanie and we came up with our top 5. So this one's not necessarily a question, just kind of what we find happening a lot is that especially newer agents wait until the last minute to ask us to review something. And I think it's that you don't think you're going to have to write an offer. I'm new. I'm not going to have to write an offer yet. I'm new. I'm not going to have a listing yet. And then lo and behold, so-and-so saw something, you're running out, you're showing something, and now you've never drafted an offer before. So our big thing is we can't draft it for you. And if you have a tight deadline, it's really not advantageous to anybody to do it last minute. So really encouraging people to practice. We will review contracts. Do a practice one and just say, hey, you know what? I've never drafted a condo offer before. I'm just going to do one. You can even partner up with someone else in productivity. Say, hey, you pretend to be the buyer. I'll be your agent. And then let's go through an offer together and have it submitted for review. We would love for you to do that so that your first one isn't under the gun last minute. And with that, something that was brought up in the meeting was that line by line contract website of the WRA. So if you don't have that, it's WRA, and I'll put it in the chat, WRA.org/line by line. I played around on that. It is excellent. They have every form possible that you can go through and do a tutorial for. I don't know, Joni, how long has this been around, but it's phenomenal.
Wow.
I can't believe I didn't know it.
I think it's just this year.
Okay, good.
Oh, there you go.
But I mean, that's just phenomenal to use. So our number 2 is the wording on notices. We get a lot of calls where people say, okay, I have to serve a notice, but I don't know what language to put on it. If you go back in your offer, almost every contingency will really guide you through what to put. So, if you want to rescind on condo docs, I've had people call me, well, how do I do that? It's right in that section, buyer serving notice that there's unsatisfactory review of the condo documents. I think people make it a little bit more complicated than need be. Of course, we're here to review those with you and help you with the language, but really refer back to the clause and what does it say the buyer needs to do on it. The number 3 we get is, when do I use an amendment, a counter, or a notice? This has come up lately where we have a buyer's agent that will call in and they wrote an offer and then they want to better their own terms and they think they have to resubmit an offer. You don't redo your offer, you use a counter. And the other question we get a lot is, what needs to be on the counter? Remember, unless otherwise put on the counter, it reverts back to the original offer. So you don't have to restate the things that are already there. And then the other one is the notice and the amendment. Amendment is, we're still trying to work through this. Let's get both sides on it. A notice is a notice. And this most common, people have the question, well, I want to send a notice of defects for the home inspection. And then we'll say, well, are these just requests that you're hoping if the seller does, we can still move forward? Well, yeah. Okay, well, then that's an amendment. A notice is a little bit more of, we're ending the conversation, so to speak. And here's your ultimatum of what you want to do, depending if the seller has the right to cure defects or not. Number 4 is binding acceptance. So there's a little bit of a difference between acceptance and binding acceptance. So line 43 of the offer says acceptance occurs when buyer and seller have signed one copy of the offer. Binding acceptance on line 39 is the offer is then binding upon both parties only if a copy of the accepted offer has been delivered on or before, and whatever your binding acceptance date is. So the important thing to know about this, and here's why, even if you've been in the business a while, you really have to think about it. I did this. I had the buyer, we accepted the offer and I had them sign, and that was late Sunday night. And I thought, I'm going to deliver this to the other agent tomorrow because I'm going to have my day start tomorrow. No, acceptance is when all your dates and deadlines come from. So I delivered it on Monday and kind of just forgot and thought, well, that's my binding acceptance date, which it was. But then all the dates and the deadlines come from actual acceptance, which was that Sunday. Why that's so important is, obviously, if you're off on one day, some of those contingencies just fall off if the deadline happens, like home inspection is a big one. And I was off on my date by that. And this was recently that I made that mistake. So just again, remembering that in the offer, unless otherwise stated, most of those things like earnest money, home inspection, radon testing, it all comes from the date of acceptance. And then our 5th one, which kind of ties into that, is when you call, really knowing your dates and deadlines is so important. When we're trying to help you, it's really advantageous to know, well, when does that expire? And I'm very surprised that a lot of people don't know that. So our tip is, when you get an accepted offer, those dates and deadlines should go in your calendar. You should send an email to your client so they know when everything is due. You should send it in an email to the co-broke, and I'd say to the lender too. Then if there's any discrepancy, which is actually how I found out that I had missed this, the co-broke on the other side said, wait, our dates are off a little bit. And then we found out why they were off. Much better to find out then and have your dates sync up than to find out in a bad way. And then you're calling Joni in a pinch and saying, we've got a problem here. We screwed up our dates and deadlines. So those are my top 5. And you guys are all awesome, and you can always call in, and never apologize for calling in and starting out with, I'm sorry to bother you. You're never a bother. You have business and it's awesome, and we're here to help. So
Sarah
that's
Jo,
all I got.
may I add something from personal experience with the dates? Because of course it was my first offer to purchase. It was my own, but I really didn't think about, and I wanted to make it clean and seem like I was, really open to working. So I didn't think about additional inspections, for instance. So really thinking about how many days do you want to give yourself to have all the inspections in line. So for instance, I wrote the offer to purchase with just 10 days, but then was rushing to get the initial home inspection and then an additional foundation inspection as well, trying to cram that into just 10 days. So, that was a key learning for me, just to also really think about the situation and what the buyer wants to do sort of post acceptance as well.
And you have to be careful with that, because if you have your inspection contingencies too long, that doesn't show up as a strong offer.
Right.
But that's also, I know that in our templates at JSG, we have incorporated if any of the dates and deadlines would fall on a, what is it, Bev, a holiday
Or weekend.
and a
Holiday
weekend.
or weekend. Thank you.
Yeah. Holiday or weekend, those days are not put into place. This, you guys, saved my rear end on an offer because it was in there. And I think this was a while ago, the buyer wanted to get out because they thought the deadline lapsed. And I went, oh no, please look at page da-da-da. And they went, oh. So good thing to have in your offer to purchase.
Oh, go ahead, Janine.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was, so with the home inspection one, because that usually is where you end up getting tight on it or extending. I had one where I wrote recently for 12 days and the listing agent pushed back and said, I really want this at 10 days. And I told her, here are the inspectors I've called and here's when they're available. And then I said, if we do the 10 days, I'm just going to come back and ask you for an extension. So something you can do with when you know you're going to get accepted offer, I start calling those home inspectors right away. Now, ultimately, it's whoever the buyer wants, but I need to know how far are the main inspectors booking out. And different times of the year, different things you'll see it ebb and flow. So sometimes 10 days is very realistic. Same thing with appraisal. Sometimes shorter appraisal timeframes are realistic, and sometimes they're just simply not. And you almost have to educate the other agent saying, hey, I'd love to get this done in that amount of time too. But realistically, everyone's booking out this far. So I don't see how that's going to be possible.
Janine, may I ask for a clarification of what you just said, and Bev as well? On all the JSG contracts, weekends and holidays are not included. So if you say it's 10 days, it's actually for us 10 business days?
Yeah,
Yes,
it would be on offers. Yeah.
on offers.
Oh,
Only if you put that provision in.
And if the provision's in there, yeah.
Yep.
and it's in all the JSG contracts.
It is, I'm going to go through them today and double check that we've got them in everything that you have.
Got it. Thank
Yep.
you.
Also, guys, when you're doing, as you brought this up, counter offers, this was my number one nightmare. I think I've talked about this, several times because I'm still having trauma with it. I think I was maybe in my first year and I was the listing agent. We were countering back and I messed up, you guys. I did not put in when, like on my fourth counter, the lower or the higher price that we agreed upon. It defaulted back to the offer price. So when the counters were accepted, I literally woke up in the middle of the night thinking, oh my God, what have I done? My sellers just accepted an offer much less than what they thought. And it was my fault. So, and it didn't come together anyway. It fell apart. But one mistake like that, I mean, I thought Janine's going to have to bring money to the closing table. And that was not going to be good. So you have one situation that scares you to death, you will be really careful moving forward. I am so conscious of that. So be careful. I cannot tell you how important it is to practice contracts. You should be able to write a condo offer to purchase, single family, duplex, off the seat of your pants is not a good idea. So be very comfortable with the contracts. And you know what? There's never a bad time to just pull up something in MLS and write an offer. So I'll talk. Yeah. All right. Anything else, Sarah Jo, or questions? from people?
Yeah, somebody had a question. They said, do you call the inspectors before you write the offer? I don't call the inspectors before I write the offer, but when I know it's going to come together, and the inspectors that I have a relationship with, that I've worked with, my clients have a 24-hour notice cancellation policy. So I will sometimes tee those up ahead of time so that I know I can get in right away. And I do call the people that I know just to say, hey, how far are you booking out? And they'll just let me know, well, I'm booking out over a week. I'm actually got some openings. So I get a better sense of things. And I'll do that right before I know a deal is coming together.
And as the market heats up, it's going to be a definite factor of shortage of appraisers and inspectors.
And somebody asked me this question. They did the showing. They noticed that the basement looked as though it was going to need some attention by a basement contractor, beams, whatever. Nothing was presented on the condition report. And they wanted to bring in the basement contractor before the home inspection was done. Joan?
Well, they can do that if they have in their offer on that blank line under inspections, where lots of agents erroneously always put entire premises. You don't put entire premises, you put what particular area of the house that you and the buyer noticed as you were going through the house. So I would put on that line of basement foundation. And it just alerts the seller that you are going to be getting an extra inspector in there to look at the basement. And you don't have to rely on the primary inspector not saying anything about the basement, because your follow-up inspections can only be those noted in an inspection or those that you have put on that line. So.
And you know what, you guys, what I typically do in my offer to purchase is, because I don't know, even if I don't see it, I don't know, I'll put inspection to include roof, foundation, chimney, not just the entire premise. You have to be a little specific. Some contractors will not, like Verret, unless it has been inspected and been called out, they are not going to come out and take a look at that basement. They're just not. So just be careful in how you write that offer. Any other questions for Sarah Jo? Okay, well.
Sorry, Janine, may I ask, you then always write into your offers to purchase roof, chimney, basement?
If it's a new roof, probably not.
Right.
But most likely, if it isn't, I'm going to write those in to cover myself.
Got it.
If I need to get a chimney person out there sooner than later, they may be there at the same time the inspector is. I mean, I want to get ahead of the game instead of having to push it out. And the listing agent's going to be well aware, you know what, this chimney looks a little wonky, or, you know, whatever. We already have it in place that it's going to be looked at.
Got it.
Yeah.
You have to be a little careful with that, because sometimes a lender will notice that on the offer that you have said that you're going to have chimney, roof.
Yep.
And they will say, where's your chimney inspection? Where's your roof inspection? And then you have to do an amendment saying that they decided not to have that inspection. But if you put those in there that you're going to have them, then the buyer will want to know what happened.
And what if a lender wants to see the inspection report? Do you like just send it right over there and to the, oh, okay, good. Everyone's shaking their heads. Good. Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah.
Don't do that. All right, Joan, what do you got?
Well, Steph and I, every once in a while talk to each other about what's trending and what's happening with our calls that we're getting. And obviously, as you can imagine, our calls reflect on the condition of the current market. So our current market is a little frustrating right now. And we're not necessarily seeing 25 offers on a property and properties going, 50,000 over and all that. But there is still some competition. We are still seeing some escalation clauses being used, and I wasn't going to talk about the new form, but I want you all to make sure that you are aware of the new AC form, which collects 3 addendums that we were using, escalation clause being one of them. And so as Steph and I were talking, we're saying we're still seeing or still getting questions about escalation clause. We both recommend that if you are making a choice of whether it's a one-time repeat of the escalation, that you keep it to one time and you don't check the more additional times, whatever it reads. In the new one, it does have the purchase price of this offer may be increased once or more than once. It is so complicated when it gets to more than once. And I think it's a good policy to just say, if I'm going to do it, I'm just going to do a one-time escalation and that's it. It keeps it simple and to the point, but we've seen just cobwebs of complications when it gets to more than once. But that's just short. That's not one of my 5, but I was thinking about when I brought up questions that I get. A lot of times are about the notice of defect and how it's written. I think our agents are pretty well trained to a correct writing of a notice of defect. This is a notice of defects based on defects found in the inspection. But a lot of the offers that we're getting and notice of defects that we're getting from Crowbroke sometimes are just a mess. And they don't follow the instructions of how to fill out a notice of defect. And then the call is, what do I do with this? So a notice of defect should start with, this is a notice of defect. I actually write that into the notice. And then you say, these are the following defects to which the buyer objects. And then you list them as the defects that were found and noted in the inspection by the inspector. You please do not copy and paste what the inspector said about those defects. Please do not include instructions on how it should be done or what the danger of it is and all of that. It is only to be a list of the defects, purposely put so if the seller has the right to cure, the seller knows what he has to cure, and he will have a copy of the inspection report to see what the inspector said about that defect. But all you're to do is to list the defects. If you get a notice of defect and you're the listing agent, you and the seller really have to make a call to that buyer's agent and say, we really cannot deal with this. We cannot decide whether we are to cure this or not because of the way this notice of defect is written. Please review with your broker and send us a correct form of a notice of defect. We've had to do that many times, but you really can't deal with a notice of defect that is written so poorly. But stick to just the list of defects that the inspector cited in their inspection report and send that off. The other thing that we've also found is some of the agents are in a situation where the buyer and the seller want to keep negotiating after a notice of defect has been discovered or it's sent. And it can be done. You have to send an amendment signed by both parties that the notice of defect is hereby withdrawn. And then you talk about the concessions or the negotiating that the parties can go into. So they go back to the amendment stage of trying to come to an agreement on what's to be done, whether it's a reduction of price, closing cost credits, repairs actually made prior to closing. Please try to avoid escrows and things done after closing. Please try to avoid them if you can, because it's very difficult to find someone who will hold an escrow these days, and they become a bit of a nightmare. So knowing how to write a defect or knowing how to receive a poorly written notice of defect, I think is a call that we're getting quite a bit. Another one that I put, and this is a whole hour topic, but it is something, I'm not going to go into it for an hour, but it is a lot of questions we get regarding the right to cure. What was the right to cure in the inspection contingency, and what does the right to cure mean in the appraisal contingency? Basically, as Sarah Jo said, all of those things are explained right in the offer. It tells you right in the offer what the right to cure means if the seller has the right to cure. What do you have to do as the buyer? You have to send a notice of the defects. What does the buyer have to do? The buyer has so many days, usually 10, to send a notice back saying they will cure the defects and the offer stays intact. Or the seller has those 10 days to send a notice back saying they're not going to cure and the offer is ended. Or if the seller just ignores the 10 days and doesn't send anything after those 10 days, the offer is also terminated, ended, and this buyer should be able to get their earnest money back. But those questions on right to cure, as I said, I mean, I used to say this a long time ago as a manager for 18 years. The secret to being a manager of an office is every answer is in the contract. Every single answer is in the contract. It's just whether the interpretation of it, sometimes we need a lawyer, sometimes we need to call the hotline about the interpretation, but everything is written out. That's why we have 10-page offers now. It started at 1.5 pages.
One question that comes up a lot is if they have disclosed on their condition report a defect, and you have given the seller the right to cure, the question that always comes to us is, if they've disclosed it, can we still ask them to fix it if it's a defect?
Well, you can cross that part of the offer off. I'm not sure. I think it's line 110 or something. It's a very famous line that says that any defects that you know before or that you were aware of when you wrote the offer cannot be called a defect. You can cross that line off, and then you can use anything as a defect.
Well, I'll pull it up and look.
Line 210.
Line 210, yeah.
For purposes of this contingency, defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions, the nature and extent of which the buyer had actual knowledge or written notice before writing this offer. So you can't touch those defects that you read about in the condition report or what you saw going through the house. Cross those lines out. And that means you can use any defect that by the time you're ready to deal with the inspection contingency, you don't want it. You want to also be able to use as in the notice of defect.
I like that one, Joni, especially when you have a real estate condition report and the seller just marks it and doesn't elaborate.
Yeah.
You're left guessing and you're like, well, again, like you said, it would be for someone legally to decide, but how are we supposed to decide there's a defect in the foundation and not really know what it is? Well, the snow's coming. Sorry.
I
just
saw
the
that,
snow
you guys. Wow.
So I like that. I don't use it a lot, but I do when it's a sloppy condition report.
Yeah, the little phrase, to the extent of which, is actually a legal phrase. and there's a lot of gray in that phrase, to the extent of which. The condition report can say trickle of water, after heavy rain, and then during the inspection and maybe subsequent inspections, they find out that after any rain, there has been significant water damage and water in the basement. So the extent of which they said in the condition report, a trickle of water, it is much greater than that. It's a much greater extent of water in the basement, and you can use that then as a defect. But again, anytime, Steph and I are always willing to go through these situations with you. You have the hotline and you have Steph or me. I basically cover the North Shore and Wauwatosa, but I do take calls from Lake Country. Steph basically is Lake Country and Wauwatosa, but she'll occasionally take calls too if we can't be reached. But I think you have a great support system here at Keller Williams to get the answers that you need. Real estate is spontaneous. It's not very little of it is planned ahead. So we are here in those spontaneous things. Hard to reach me after 9 o'clock at night, though. I'm usually snoring by that.
Good for you.
And the third one that I have, this just came across on a question. I looked it up in WRA and I was really surprised. It's something new, but it's who can and who cannot attend an inspection. We had an issue where there was a sort of a battle going on between the buyer's agent and the listing agent, because the buyer's agent was Keller Williams and the listing agent was from another firm. And they were furious and threatening to do a lawsuit, and the sellers were livid, and the whole business was, poorly done because the agent was not present at the inspection. And how dare you let these buyers come in alone with the inspector? And, I had to send him a copy of the real estate rules, the REEB rules, that says that an inspector is a licensed inspector in the state of Wisconsin. He's registered as an inspector in the state of Wisconsin, has as much ability to enter a property as we real estate agents do. So a buyer and the inspector can go in on an inspection if the buyer's agent cannot be there. The listing agent can be there if they want. It's the sellers can be there, although that's always kind of a little awkward. But who cannot be there, and I love this new provision, is an entourage of the buyer, meaning the know-it-all daddy who knows everything about real estate and construction and leaks in the walls, and inspect other inspectors or family members who have some like our carpenter or things like that. But only, and it specifically says only the person involved in the offer to purchase is allowed to be in the during the inspector. The wording is, the offer does not allow access for a buyer's entourage, which in this context could include family members, persons whose observations would be critical to the buyer's choice to make an offer on terms upon which the buyer would do so. Buyers or licensees or both may be present at all inspections or testings. It doesn't say that agents must be. Now, here at Keller Williams, we think it's very good practice, smart practice, and professional practice for a Keller Williams agent to be present at your buyer's inspection. I mean, obviously there are times you can't be there. You can always ask another Keller Williams agent to be in attendance there, and that's fine. But the buyers and the inspector can be there without any agent. So,
But Joan, because I've been at inspections where the entire family's there, but do you recommend then that we ask everyone prior, just to say it's only the people involved in the offer to purchase, etc. And then when they insist, what is your recommendation on us doing that?
Just say that you can set them up with another showing, but it can't be during the inspection. That the guidelines for inspection in the state of Wisconsin, I mean, throw in as much blah, blah, blah as you can, do not allow anyone except for the person writing the offer.
Joni, what if you ask the seller for permission, or if that's unrelated because it's a statute?
You probably can ask the
Yeah.
seller, but the seller has the right. The seller has, yeah, it actually says though, I have this, it's from a legal hot tip, October 26th, 2020. But it says that the seller can permit other people to come, but the seller doesn't have to say a word, and at that point, they cannot come if the seller hasn't given permission.
Okay.
And it wouldn't be very smart, I think, of a seller to allow it.
No, I think the only time sometimes is if you already have permission for like a roofer to come in and the seller says, well, since you're there anyway, allow the other person to come, right? Like you could double up on the home inspection, but it's saying you can't just have like somebody's friend who happens to be a plumber come through at the same time. I did not know that. That's so interesting.
Yeah, no, it came out when we were being attacked by this Cobrook. We were doing everything wrong and he was doing everything right. And so all I had to do is send him a copy of the WRA hotline.
But can you imagine, as a seller, you're feeling extremely vulnerable to begin with. Your house is being inspected and only the inspector and the buyer show up. I mean, I know that they can, but going back to Joan's point, my brother-in-law is an inspector and he said, I cannot believe, and they're not KW people, the amount of buyers that show up to these inspections without their agent, thinking their agent's going to come, and they are literally, they don't know what to do. So I think it's
I agree.
important to be there. And the protocol when you are at an inspection is basically to keep your mouth shut. Because you are not the inspector. Ask the inspector. You know, I bring my laptop. I always say, hey guys, I'm going to be in the kitchen working, and this is your time with the inspector. Any questions, go to he or she, and they will do a wrap up at the end. But don't get involved in the conversation. If you're new, I highly suggest you let the inspector know and say, would you mind, I'm just going to bring a notebook and take some notes as you're going through the property. I may ask a couple questions just for my own information moving forward. And don't be afraid to do that.
One of the important reasons why you should be there with your buyers is tone. A lot of things written in the inspection report follow the program of the inspection report. It's sort of like fill in the blanks kind of thing. And there's no discernation right, of tone. The inspector could have said at the time, this is something that you see often and things like that, but it really should be fixed. It's important to have it fixed. And he'll put it down as a defect. But when you get the report and this is cited as a defect, it becomes, all kinds of alarm bells on it. You being there can help calm or remind the buyer of the tone of the inspector on this and what was really important, what is something that is part of home ownership, even though it is a defect, or something that really is calamitous and if not taken care of can devalue your house or can make things worse, and following the definitions of defect. But I think it's important as a professional to be there. I think it's important also to be at your closings. Those are two things I think that develop a reputation among a firm, is to have agents who are there for their clients, especially.
Can I tell a good story about coming to a closing?
Yes.
I was at a closing And I was a listing agent and the buyers were there and the buyer's agent did not show up for them. And they had a lot of questions and you just answer the questions. Well, when it came to sell their home, they called me and they remembered how I was at the closing table. And that was the last contact. You have to make an impression, and their own agent, didn't feel a need to be there. And sometimes I know people pre-sign, but they were first-time home buyers and they really wanted that extra, I know that you're kind of glorified wallpaper, but you're also a cheerleader and it's an exciting time for them. And people remember that.
Got to be there for 'em. Yeah. And that's the best time because everybody's happy. That's the best time to continue to ask for referrals from them going forward. The fourth thing that I hear a lot about is unfortunately deals falling apart. And what do we do? How do we camera out? Do I send the camera now? Do I wait for them to sign the camera and things like that? Again, this is all defined actually in the cancellation agreement and mutual release form. It explains exactly how it's to be dealt with. But if you are terminating a contract as a buyer's agent, you have to do it without being in default. You have to be exiting the contract on a contingency that was not met or satisfied. You can't just say, I don't want this house anymore. Otherwise, that's a default of a contract. You want to do it properly and terminate the contract through a contingency that wasn't met. If there is a contingency that wasn't met, inspection, financing, appraisal, any of those, you've gone through the amendments, you've gone through everything, you are to terminate the contract by writing a notice saying this contract is hereby terminated, or however you want to say, and all earnest monies to be delivered to buyer. But you say it is based on, and you cite the contingency that was not satisfied. That's the proper way to end a contract based on an unsatisfied contingency. When you accompany that with a cancellation agreement and mutual release, the camera, directing the earnest money to go to your buyer. If there's a dispute, then the dispute is not yours to dispute. The dispute becomes something that actually can be handled in small claims court. If it goes that far, it is something that your buyer needs to really contact an attorney and get legal advice on it. A lot of times, and I mean a lot of times, the seller won't sign that camera just out of spite. They're just mad, and they don't believe that the contingency was handled correctly, or they don't believe it was a defect, or blah, 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 blah. But they're really mad and upset, and they refuse to sign the camera. Then we wait. Your buyer must either contact an attorney or wait or send repeated dialogue, keep up repeated dialogue with the listing agent and their broker may help work with the seller to get them to sign, or the seller will get an attorney, and at that point then your buyer needs to get an attorney. And as I said, all earnest money disputes can be handled in small claims court, which is just a few $100s. You don't need to hire an attorney per se to go through small claims court. There is a judge there who decides who gets what. But if nobody responds after 5 years, it is considered abandoned, and all sorts of different things can happen at that point. But the company who's holding the earnest money cannot disperse the earnest money without some direction, and the direction is the camera. The only time where you, skip a notice and that goes along with the camera is really when both parties say, we're out, we don't care, we're out, go away, get your earnest money back. And if there's really no need for the notice or anything, to be specific, both parties can sign the camera and the buyer gets their earnest money back. I'm sorry, Janine.
So if, let's say that they are still battling out the release of the earnest money.
You froze up, Janine. Everybody else is here? Okay, she'll come back. Yeah,
I think she was going to ask, and I could be wrong, but I think she's going to ask if the buyer has signed, but the seller refuses, can the buyer go on to buy a new property?
only if he gets the advice from an attorney.
Okay.
We cannot say, oh, you can write an offer on this house. I know you love it. You can write an offer. They
Mhm.
really need the opinion of an attorney to give them the go-ahead to write.
And then the seller is, they, by refusing to sign the CAMA, they cannot go ahead and relist that property.
They can relist it. They just have to realize, hopefully with the advice of their attorney, that they cannot accept an offer that isn't contingent on their getting released from this offer. So if they get an offer, they basically, they can, there's a dispute on whether it has to be a secondary offer or not, but say they get it, they list it, they get an offer, and they have to counter that offer saying it's contingent on their getting a final release from that, the other party in the other deal. Again, we really can't lay this out for them. It is something that this definitely becomes a legal issue, and we have to refer. I have names of attorneys. We all have good real estate attorneys. Please only get a real estate attorney. Don't get your brother who does probate. You need, you can call the legal hotline because those are lawyers answering the calls there. They can give you a general idea of what to do at this point. But I'll tell you, the very last sentence in every legal hotline answer is consult an attorney. So, any other questions about the camera and the earnest money? It's something that we see a lot of, and a lot of it is the sellers are just. Well, my last one is, and again, this could be a full-length discussion as well, but we see a lot of calls on this lately. Steph and I were talking about just last week on as-is listings and inspections for information only. An as-is listing can be interpreted in many different ways by both buyer and seller. Seller can have one something intending to mean what as is means, meaning they're not going to do a damn thing to fix the house. Or it could mean that it's in an estate and there's nobody responsible to make any corrections. Usually you'll see an as is listing if it is in some kind of an estate or trust. And that just means there's nobody responsible to actually do that. The buyer is buying it as it is. But that because there are some discrepancies on what the intention of an as-is listing is, the general idea is for a buyer to definitely have an inspection. I've had questions like, can they have an inspection if it's an as-is listing? Definitely get the best inspector out there, get a thorough inspection, because you're not going to get anything from anybody else. They generally don't have condition report in those situations that are listings by the court. You also need to realize you probably don't want to give them right to cure because they've already stated they're not going to cure. You can attempt to put in right to cure, but for the most part, it's the benefit of your buyer not to have the right to cure. So they can terminate the contract with anything that they see in the house that they don't want. That's basically what it is, but it does mean that generally the seller is not going to make any corrections on the house. But I have seen exceptions to that. You know, they'll say, will they do this? And they'll say, well, yeah, they'll fix that for you. So, the other thing with information only inspections, that was pretty rampant during the high competitiveness of our market. when multiple offers were coming in, they were ditching the whole concept of even having an inspection. And then we all came up with the added clause that they understand the importance of an inspection, but have elected not to do so, kind of a waiver. It's very important. I've seen so many situations of post-closing losses in my 20 years of being a manager. It is something that we have to disclose upfront. The sellers have to disclose upfront, but for a buyer to go in there for an for an information only inspection, something's going to turn up and the buyers are going to want to get out based on that defect. Well, they don't have that right because they have waived the inspection. They don't have the right to file a notice of defect. They have to accept what they have bought without any notice of defect because their inspection was only for their information. Well, sometimes they get information that they didn't want to hear about. But it is something that the seller probably doesn't want to agree to either, because anything that is found in that inspection, even information only, that seller is going to have to disclose going forward. So even though it may be the only way to keep a deal together, you have to really think it out. What are the benefits to a buyer for information only? Means they probably get picked as the winning offer. What are the benefits to a seller for no inspection, but an inspection for information only? I'd say there's a big risk there for the seller. And you and your seller have to decide what that means, what it entails. Basically, all you're doing is allowing access to the seller's property for this inspector to come in and do it. But no other privileges of the inspection contingency are given to the buyer at that point. Any questions about that?
Joan, may I go back and ask a question about a comment you made earlier?
Sure.
If you give the seller no right to cure on an as-is listing, how would you manage then negotiating maybe a price reduction?
You can always try to negotiate with an amendment on anything.
Got it. But it's down to the amendment then.
Right, you would have to do it with an amendment. They have to be both parties agree.
Right.
But you can't do it with a notice of defect.
Right. Got it.
Yeah, it's a good question. Any other questions on what Sarah, Jo, and I have sort of brought up? I think they're good examples of a reflection of the market. Our questions change as the market changes. It is something that we're always willing, between the four of us, basically, and then your other support that you have in this business, either your team leaders or your accelerator as you're coming in new. Productivity is just phenomenal support for you. Launch. All of those things are geared for you to be a competent professional real estate agent. And we want to maintain the reputation of Keller Williams of having smart professional agents working for us. And it seems we do.
I'm just checking the chat to see if there's any other questions.
Janine just texted me. She said
Oh.
her internet is completely out. So she
Oh,
feels bad that she can't hop on the call. Her son is trying to get it started, but it's just not going. So
it's that kind of day.
are there any other questions or? I don't think so.
Well, enjoy your snow day, everyone. It looks like it did come.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Awesome.
looking pretty again.
Okay. Yeah.
All
Well,
right.
stay
Thank you,
safe,
everybody.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.